All of us do it, no matter how long we've been walking in Christ. Breaking down these verses, we see that the new believers had formed their new identity through what Paul calls learning Christ. And he uses that phrase, I think, in verse 20, though it's not translated that way in the NIV. Yet before they learned Christ, they were like everyone else in Ephesus. Pre-Christ, Paul writes, they were futile in their thinking. What does that mean? Well, it means that they relied on themselves, but it wasn't working. That's what futile means. It's just they were making efforts that weren't working. Because relying on self has no future, because only the resurrected self, only the in Christ self has a future. The old self is dying. The new self, the one that's in Christ, the one that's centered on his resurrection, is the only one that's living. And so, pre-Christ, they were futile in the decisions that they were making, relying on themselves. Pre-Christ, Paul writes, they were darkened in their understanding. Well, when you're darkened in your understanding, what do you lack? You lack light. Who's the light? Christ is the light. His truth is the light. Without Christ, they had no light. Now, what does that mean? What does this image of light and darkness mean? I think Paul's talking about decision-making. He says understanding. And in the Old Testament, in the Proverbs, when they talk about understanding, it's not some big mystical thing. It's understanding how to make practical decisions in light of our relationship with God. And before we know Christ, we don't have that. We're just kind of fumbling around in the dark. Then the light comes on. The truth of Christ is in our lives, and it's in light of the truth of Christ that we can now make wise decisions. Pre-Christ, he goes on, they were separated from the life of God. They were on the road to spiritual death, and without the risen Christ, their lives had no future. Pre-Christ, they were separated from him because of the ignorance, as he writes. Pre-Christ, they had lost all sensitivity. Pre-Christ, they had given themselves over to a life based on the five senses, sensuality, so to indulge in every kind of impurity, as Paul writes. They continually chose evil. They wanted more and more in a never-ending drive to be happy. Why? Because they had nothing else in their life with which to satisfy them. And Paul says, look, that's what you used to be. That's your old identity. That's where you used to hold your citizenship. But now, he says, you've got a different identity. And so he wants them to make a break from that past. He's trying to give them a spiritual kick in the rear to get going with this new life, this new identity they've taken on in baptism and in faith. Now, that's a pretty dim view of humanity in the world, isn't it? To say that everything's futile, that it's dark, that people are separated, that people are walking in ignorance, that they're not sensitive, that they're all about the senses. It's a pretty dim view of humanity and of the world, but you only need to listen to 5 minutes of the evening news to know it's true. It's true. To take a dim view of the world without God is the right view of the world without God, because that's the way it is out there. The problem is, you and I tend to think of the world as something out there, but it actually takes root in here. It's your problem and my problem as much as it is the politicians in other countries and those other people who are bothering us, their problem. All of us without Christ are separated from God. All of us are darkened without Christ in our understanding. All of us are unable to think and decide clearly. All of us are messed up in our relationships. All of us experience brokenness in our attempts to form friendships and community. All of us are frustrated, or we should be, by injustice. That's because our old pre-Christian identity is clouded by sin. We're unable to see the light of the truth. You've heard of the fog or the confusion of war, the fog of war, that you're in the middle of a battle and you can't see what's going on because you can't see the big picture. Well, without the bright light of Christ shining in our hearts, there's simply too much fog for us to think clearly and choose wisely. Before they learned Christ, the Ephesians did not have this. They were not God's people. They were not people of the covenant. They were not children of the Almighty. They lacked the very thing which all of us needs. Many of them were Greek by birth and Roman by citizenry. Many of them were Greek by birth and Roman by citizenry. But neither advantage did them any good morally or spiritually. The same is true for us. We live in a great country. We have wonderful freedoms. But if we don't live as Christian Americans out of who we are in Christ, then all the freedom and liberty and benefits we have are in vain, because we're not deciding wisely. We're not taking, and however great a gift it is to live in this country, an even greater gift is to know Christ. And to not take advantage of that is to miss the biggest opportunity of all. Paul vividly describes their former pre-Christian life because the change, as I said, in them was not yet complete. They had taken on a new identity in Christ, but they were still struggling with the transition from old to new. And the struggles we have, and I want to give you this assurance, the struggles we have between old and new identities is something that God knows about, and that God's not scared of, and we shouldn't be either, because God's ready to help us in that struggle and making the transition from old to new. A transition which won't be 100% complete until Jesus Christ comes back, until we're with Him in glory, living in the fullness of resurrection. Conversion is a process. There is a moment, I think, when each of us becomes a Christian, when the light is switched on, when we say, aha. There's a process, but there's a moment, I think, for each of us. And sometimes it happens, we look back on it and say, that was it. Or sometimes we're fully aware of it. Or sometimes, maybe it happened so long ago you don't remember it. But it happened. There was a moment when the light went on. Yet God was working in our lives even before then, and God's still working in our lives to shape us more and more in Christ's image. We occasionally, or perhaps often, need that kick in the rear to get our spiritual lives back on track. And this is what Paul was doing in reminding the Ephesians of their former identity in verses 17 and 19, and now of their new identity in verses 20 through 24. You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of Him and were taught in Him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life, the old life, to put off your old self, take off that old cloak before you go in the baptism waters, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. And as I describe the baptism scene, this is some of the background, we think, for this language of putting off our old self, of removing the old identity and discarding that pre-conversion, that pre-baptism piece of clothing. The old self is no longer of use to us because we have a new, a better self, the Christ self. And it's kind of the image of as it would be if Superman would stop being Clark Kent altogether and was Superman all the time. If that were if this were true, he would no longer need the business suit, would he? He'd only need the cape and the tights and the big S on his chest. That would be